Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really going to zero in on intercultural communication for your exam prep.
That's right. We're talking fundamental concepts, key theories, the essential definitions you'll need.
Think of this as getting straight to the core ideas, yeah. Building that strong foundation.
Exactly. We're diving into the introductory materials, specifically focusing on, well, what is culture? And how does it link to communication?
So the goal here is clarity, right? Getting the vocabulary down, understanding why this stuff matters for the real world and for your exams.
Precisely. We want to unpack how different scholars look at this field so you can grasp the nuances.
Okay, let's dive in then. Intercultural communication. What is it, fundamentally?
Well, at its simplest, it's studying interaction, between people from different cultural backgrounds.
But it's more than just observing, isn't it? There's a back and forth.
Absolutely. It's reciprocal. Culture shapes our communication, definitely. But just as importantly, our communication shapes our culture. It creates it, even.
Interesting. And we tend to use these quick labels in everyday life, don't we? Like nationality, language.
Ethnicity, religion, yeah. We use these stickers, as the material calls them.
Stickers, I like that. They seem useful for, like, a first impression.
They can be. They offer a starting point, maybe.
Yeah.
But there's a danger there.
The danger.
Yeah, they can really oversimplify who someone is. You rely too much on those stickers, and you end up with generalizations, stereotypes even.
Which can push people apart instead of bringing them together.
Exactly. It reinforces distance sometimes.
So that leads to a really central question, especially for exam prep.
Yeah.
Do these labels help us connect, or do they just reinforce the divides?
And to answer that, you really need to get into what culture actually means. How's it tied to communication?
Right. So the materials outline two major ways of thinking about culture.
Yes. The first one is often called the entity approach, or essentialist.
Okay, entity approach. What's the core idea there? What should we remember?
This view basically sees culture as something fixed, stable, a set of shared characteristics, maybe behaviors, values, defining a group. Often we think of it as a nation.
So people have a culture,
Right.
or they belong to one.
That's the idea. You possess it. And communication, well, it's seen as being shaped by that fixed culture.
Like the culture comes first and the communication style follows automatically.
Pretty much. The culture dictates the communication.
There was that airline example, right? Italian versus British staff.
Yes, exactly. The Italian worker bending the rules, the British one sticking strictly to them.
And that's explained by their national culture as this fixed thing.
According to this entity view, yes, it points to underlying stable national values.
Okay, so what's good about this approach? Why use it?
Well, it makes comparisons easier. You can talk about Italian culture versus British culture quite directly. It offers straightforward generalizations,
Which can be helpful to start with, maybe?
can be, but the limitations are pretty significant, especially when you dig deeper.
Right. What are those limitations we need to watch out for?
Well, first off, it really oversimplifies things. It tends to assume one person, one culture, usually national.
But life isn't like that, is it? People have multiple identities.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
ignores how identities overlapped, how they change. And crucially, it misses how culture is actually made in everyday life, through interaction.
Okay, that's a really important point. It doesn't capture the active part.
Not really. Which brings us to the other main approach.
The social constructionist one, or process approach.
That's the one. And it offers a very different picture.
How so?
Instead of culture being this fixed thing before communication, this view says culture actually emerges through communication.
Through it. So communication isn't just influenced by culture.
It actively creates culture.
Yeah.
Our talk, texts, images, the things we do. That's where cultural meanings get made and negotiated, constantly.
So culture isn't this rigid box dictating things.
No, it's seen as a dynamic process, flexible, built through interaction.
The example about perceptions of Africa fits here, doesn't it?
Perfectly. How films, media, even just conversations construct this image of Africa, often based on stereotypes, unfortunately.
So those images build a cultural understanding rather than just reflecting some fixed reality.
Precisely. It shows culture being constructed.
This process view seems to fit better with, well, how complex the world feels today, globalization and all that.
It does.
Yeah.
Its strength is capturing change, flexibility, the complexity of modern identities, people moving between cultures, mixing them.
It helps explain those mixed dynamic experiences much better.
Definitely.
But are there downsides, limitations to this process approach?
Well, it can make culture harder to pin down, to define clearly or measure. If it's always changing, always being negotiated.
Comparisons between groups get trickier too, I imagine.
They do. You can't just list off traits quite so easily.
Now, the materials stress that how you understand culture really matters for research. The airline study is a key example again here, right?
Absolutely. If you start with the entity view culture as fixed national character, you look at the British and Italian staff and say, their national cultures explain the difference in rule following.
Okay.
But if you use a social constructionist lens, you'd look differently. You'd analyze the specific conversations, the interactions. How are they performing or negotiating cultural norms about rules? Right there in that moment.
So the starting assumption about culture completely changes what you look for and what you find.
Totally. Your understanding of culture shapes the entire research process and the conclusions.
There were other examples too, like advertising.
Yes, the Volvo #MadeBeSweden campaign.
Oh.
It's not just reflecting Swedish culture. It's actively trying to build a certain image, modern progressive Sweden, through communication.
Or the Mama Hope Project challenging stereotypes.
Right. Using media to present different, empowering narratives about African men. Again, that's communication actively constructing cultural understanding, pushing back against existing ones.
So this leads to a shift in the key question we should be asking, doesn't it? It's not just if culture matters.
Exactly. The crucial question now is more like, who is making culture relevant? And to whom? In which specific situation? And why? For what purpose?
So culture isn't this automatic explanation for everything.
No. It's something that gets brought into play, made important, or maybe ignored in specific interactions by the people involved.
Okay. The resources then give us 4 guiding questions to break down culture further. Good for exam prep. First one, what is the use of culture?
Right. How is it used in communication? Well, it can be about inclusion and exclusion, creating an us.
Defining who's in the group and who's out.
Yeah. And it's used heavily in marketing, of course,
Yeah.
appealing to identity to sell products.
Okay. Second question, what is the content of culture?
What's it made of? Could be seen as a national asset.
Yeah.
Food, art, sports, heritage.
The stuff tourist boards promote?
Exactly. Or the content could be seen as a challenge. The difficulties that arise in international work or travel because of different norms.
Like communication clashes.
Right. And a third way to see content is citizenship, the shared values or behaviors expected in a nation.
Got it. Third guiding question, what's the scope of culture? How big or small is it?
And the key here is, it's not just nations. Culture exists at many levels.
Like ethnic groups, religious communities.
Families, companies, even neighborhoods. And importantly, individuals usually belong to multiple cultural groups at the same time.
So it's layered, complex.
Very. Which leads to the final question. What is the status of culture?
And this brings us back to the 2 main approaches, right?
Exactly. Is culture an entity, something fixed that defines people? Or is it a process, something created together through communication?
And the course material leans towards.
It emphasizes the process view, culture as dynamic, evolving, made in interaction. That's the trend in the field.
Okay, now let's touch on banal nationalism, Michael Billig's idea. What's the gist of that?
Banal nationalism. It's about the everyday, often unnoticed ways our national identity gets reinforced. Not the big, loud patriotism, but the subtle stuff.
The background noise of nationhood.
Sort of, yeah. Routine symbols and practices that make belonging to the nation seem totally normal, natural, almost invisible.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Think about flags flying on government buildings, maybe schools, or how the news talks about us versus them in international stories.
Or the weather map, stopping at the border.
Exactly. Or maps in classrooms, always showing those neat national borders. It's everywhere, constantly reminding us, usually without us even thinking about it.
Subtle cues. But Billig's idea has critiques, doesn't it? Especially with globalization.
It does. Critics say it focuses too much on the nation, ignoring how complex identities are now. People identify with their religion, ethnicity, class, city, maybe more strongly than the nation sometimes.
And globalization means we connect to places all over, not just one country.
Right. People feel connections to multiple localities. Maybe your city, your online group, your company culture feel more relevant day to day.
But the nation state still holds power, doesn't it, practically?
Oh, absolutely. Passports, border controls, citizenship laws. These things still enforce national identity very strongly, especially in legal and bureaucratic terms. For security, administration.
So even if our felt identity is more complex or multi-local, the national framework is still very real institutionally.
It persists. It has huge political significance, even if its cultural dominance in daily life might be weakening for some.
Okay. And this complexity ties into the different ways researchers actually study intercultural interactions, the different types of communication research.
Yes, there are distinctions worth knowing. First, there's cross-cultural communication.
What's the focus there?
That's mostly about comparing communication styles between different cultural groups. It often assumes cultures are relatively stable entities you can compare.
Like comparing German directness to Japanese indirectness, that kind of thing.
Sort of, yes. Then there's intercultural communication.
How's that different?
This focuses more on the actual interaction happening when people from different backgrounds communicate. What happens in the conversation?
So it assumes cultures meet and clash or blend in real time?
Right. And then there's the third one, the interdiscourse approach.
Interdiscourse.
Yeah. This one is even more focused on how culture is actively created or made relevant during the communication itself, through the language used, the discourse.
So it really doubles down on that social constructionist idea. Culture isn't pre-existing, it's built in the talk.
Exactly. Understanding these distinctions, cross-cultural, intercultural, interdiscourse, really reflects those fundamental ideas about what culture is and how it works.
It's also useful to quickly touch on the historical background here, how we got to thinking about culture this way.
Yeah, briefly. Historically, especially from a Western perspective, there was often this view of other cultures as, well, inferior.
During colonialism, for instance.
Absolutely. Colonialism often involved ranking cultures hierarchically to justify domination. Edward Said's work on Orientalism is key here, too.
Orientalism.
His analysis of how Western literature and art often depicted Eastern cultures as exotic, maybe backward, sensual, needing control. It constructed a particular image.
And multiculturalism emerged partly in response to that history.
Yes, multiculturalism is about valuing and celebrating cultural differences, pushing back against the idea that any single culture is inherently superior.
Which leads into identity politics.
Right. The struggles by various cultural, ethnic, or minority groups for recognition and respect. It's about social visibility, equal rights.
And having their specific experiences and values acknowledged.
Exactly. Think about things like the hidden curriculum in schools, how national values or holidays get taught subtly, reinforcing a dominant culture without explicitly stating it as ideology.
So cultural recognition becomes really important in diverse societies.
Increasingly so. Which brings us to a final key concept from Ingrid Piller's work, this dual dynamic of cultural identity.
Dual dynamic.
Yeah. On one hand, individuals are actively doing culture, performing their identities, choosing how to express themselves.
Making choices about identity.
Right. But on the other hand, people also experience having culture done to them. Identities get ascribed by others based on things like nationality, race, religion, visible markers.
So it's about how you see yourself versus how others label you.
And the tension between those two. Understanding that push and pull is crucial for analyzing intercultural communication. How identities are negotiated, contested, sometimes imposed.
That's a really useful distinction. Okay, let's try to wrap this up with key takeaways for exam prep.
Right. So we covered the two big ways to understand culture, as a fixed entity versus a dynamic process created through communication.
And how that basic difference shapes everything, from research focus to understanding interaction.
We talked about how culture gets made relevant in specific situations. It's not automatic. And the idea of banal nationalism, those everyday reminders of the nation.
Even while globalization creates more complex, multi-local ways of belonging.
Then we touched on the different study approaches, cross-cultural, intercultural, interdiscourse, and the historical shift towards multiculturalism and identity politics.
And finally, that dual dynamic, doing culture versus having culture done to you.
Lots of core concepts there.
Definitely. So here's a final thought to mull over. How is your own sense of belonging shaped? Think about the groups you identify with, but also how others might categorize you based on, say, your passport or appearance.
How do those forces interact in your daily communication? It's worth considering.
Absolutely. And remember, for a complete summary of all these concepts, definitions, theories, plus practice tests to really nail it down for your exams, head over to gradeguru.nl.
Keep these foundational ideas in mind. They're crucial building blocks. Good luck with the preparation.